I'm Marvin Minsky, and I teach at MIT in subjects of theories about how to make machines that are intelligent, whatever that means. And I come from a combination of mathematics and physics and electrical engineering and psychology and biology, and I try to get my students to combine all those kinds of ideas to invent new things.
You wrote an essay in my first book, The Age of Intelligent Machines, and you wrote, only a few decades ago, and this was 20 years ago, the ability of organisms to reproduce seemed to be a deep and complex mystery. Yet as soon as they understood the elements of how our gene strings replicate themselves, biologists wondered why it took so long to think of such a simple thing. So how are we doing in terms of understanding these mechanisms of our thinking?
I see a problem with this field of artificial intelligence because biology and physics worked so wonderfully that the people trying to make intelligent machines would like to imitate it. For example, Archimedes discovered a few things about physics, then there was a long silence, and then Galileo and Newton came along, and Newton discovered three simple laws that explained almost all of the mechanical phenomena we see. And a century or two later, Maxwell did the same thing for electricity. There were four simple laws, and that explained electricity and magnetism. And Einstein came along and reduced those seven laws to really just one or two. And physics progressed wonderfully by finding these incredibly simple explanations. So psychologists always wanted to do that too, and they made little theories of how learning works by connecting thoughts and so forth. And we didn't see nearly so much progress after that, because 100 years ago, there were some brilliant people, Freud and Wundt and William James and Francis Galton. There were four great psychologists who made rather complicated theories about how the mind works. But then a lot of psychologists tried to imitate the physicists and reduce these to a few simple laws, and that didn't work so well, and 100 years went by without a great many discoveries. Here's what I think is the problem. The brain doesn't work in a simple way because evolution has been going on for 400 million years in building structures upon structures upon structures. The neurons in our brains are almost the same as they were 400 million years ago, but the organizations are much more complicated. So a good way to think of the brain is that it's 400 different computers. If you look in a book on neurology in the index, you see hundreds of different structures, and they each work in different ways. So I think it was a sort of mistake to look for the common principles, because the common principles will tell you how a fish works, but it won't tell you how a person works.
We are finding, for example, there appears to be some repetitive structures in the cerebral cortex and a different repetitive structure in the cerebellum. I mean, might there be some basic principles that are used as building blocks in different ways to build up these hierarchies of complex thoughts?
Yes, all the parts of the brain are similar, but if you look inside a computer, everything is made of transistors. There are slight differences between them, but the properties of transistors are annoying. They're not linear, they're not so dependable. But if you take just two transistors and put them in a certain circuit, then you get a flip-flop, and that behaves the same every time. And I suspect that the important thing about the brain was that we evolved structures. In fact, most of the higher brain is made of cortical columns, each of which have a few hundred cells. And I suspect that those insulate the rest of the mind from the properties of the neurons. So you see, a physicist might want to reduce everything down to how the individual neuron works, But I think what we need to do is understand how the columns work. And if you go from one part of the brain to another, there are hundreds of regions, and the wiring is a little bit different in each of those. And that's my conclusion is that there isn't any general principle of how people think, but the thing that makes us so smart, and I don't use the word smart, I use the word resourceful. People rarely get stuck because if some way of thinking doesn't work, they switch to another. And I think you do that by turning on little bits of brain here and there and then switching to others. So the most important thing about thinking is how some part of the brain will notice that another part isn't getting anywhere. And what does it do? It says, oh, I'll turn some of those off and I'll turn some of those on. And so it's that high-level management where you're hiring new consultants and not listening to old ones. Maybe you do this 5 times a second. You switch how you think.
How do you see the role of really modeling and simulating the human brain in understanding how it works and also then building intelligent machines?
Well, many people think that the way to understand the brain is to understand how the parts work and then how the combinations of them work and so forth, and that's been successful in physics. But you can't understand a computer by knowing how the transistors work. So people have it upside down. The way to understand the brain is to understand how thinking works. And once you have a theory of that, then you can look at this immensely complicated brain and say, well, I think this area does this and that. You can't do it from the bottom up because you don't know what to look for. So neural nets are good for some things. Statistical recognition is good for something. Rule-based systems are very popular. They're good for a lot of industrial processes. There are things called genetic programs where you make random variations in a program and select the ones that are better. And that works for some problems. I never see papers saying, here's what my neural network didn't do, no matter how long I tried it.
By the way, in our pattern recognition projects like speech recognition, we built 8 different recognizers. One was neural nets, one was Markov models, which is statistics, others were rule-based. And then we programmed an expert manager, which actually learned the strengths and weaknesses of the different systems. And
that's exactly what has to be done. The higher levels of the mind aren't dealing with sensory experiences or that sort of thing. They're dealing with patterns of thought that you've used and editing them and learning which ones to use in what conditions.
You said that one notices that this method isn't working and you're stuck, and so you change and use a different approach. That's you that's doing that. Is that a different part of the brain than the parts that are getting stuck? I mean, what is this sort of master management program that manages all these other resources?
One of these little critics said, there's been no progress toward this goal. And different parts of the brain have different goals. And this critic says, 5 minutes have passed and there's no progress. I will turn myself off and turn on these 6 other ones, and they'll fight it out for a while. So I don't think there's any self. And I like Sigmund Freud's old theory, which is that the brain starts out with a lot of little instinctive things. Every higher animal has various behaviors. It does things to move. It does things to avoid unpleasant sensations and so forth. But as we develop as humans and maybe some primates, we also develop what Freud calls ideals and aspirations and ethics and constraints, so that, for example, if a little girl wants her baby brother's toy, the best thing is to grab it. And then she learns from her parents that you're not supposed to do that. And Freud's image of development is that there are these low-level instincts that are not very different from other animals. There are these high-level values and constraints and phobias and so forth up here, which are developed in social situations. And then most of the mind is resolving conflicts. So there's no person in here, What there are these bunch of ideals and processes and high-level goals, and there are all these low-level processes. And then most of the brain is negotiating and arbitrating. There's a popular idea that if you build a baby machine, you could call it, with a simple kind of learning machine that associates ideas or remembers sequences and correlates things, that if you keep reapplying that, it'll get smarter and smarter and smarter. And that's sort of popular. And in the last 20 years, about a dozen baby machine projects were started. And all subsequent baby programs have managed to learn a couple of skills, and then you keep training them, but they don't get much better. So the difference in my approach is I think all of these different techniques that people have worked on have uses, and we just have to organize them into a larger architecture where there is also a vast amount of common sense knowledge about how to tell when one of these processes isn't working and how to, and given the symptoms of a failure, which of the other processes should you turn on. So basically we get resourcefulness from having many resources, not from having one very smart one.
So eventually we'll understand enough about the brain and have ability to send little scanners inside your brain and capture all those details, whatever those details happen to be that are important. Basically upload enough details of your mind to create an indistinguishable copy in some other machine.
Right, a wonderful future where you have backup copies, and then you can do skydiving with a little less apprehension, because if you get killed, maybe you have a backup copy last week. I know people who have all their valuable knowledge on a computer and they haven't backed it up for 6 months. Can you imagine?
And people will say, can you imagine people didn't back up their brains 100 years ago? But would you consider one of those backups to be you, or just somebody else who happens to be a lot like you?
I think it's the same thing. I'm not exactly like I was 5 minutes ago, especially after talking to Ray Kurzweil for a half hour. I'm a noticeably different person.
So if we scanned your brain and we had a really high-resolution scan and the ability to recreate you, you'd be less concerned about skydiving, and if something happened to Marvin Minsky #1?
Absolutely. But I probably wouldn't go skydiving anyway, because my time is too valuable. So if everyone had backup copies, would murder be less of a crime or not?
In the essay you wrote in my first book, you asked, why are so many people annoyed at the thought that human brains are nothing more than mere machines?
People say, well, but surely I'm a person. I'm a single thing. I'm an entity, and a machine that just has a lot of parts wouldn't have any such central device. Well, I think it's an illusion. You don't really see yourself. What you do is you make a model of yourself. Some part of your brain says, what am I? I am a body and a mind. And the other part of the brain looks at that and says, oh, I see. I'm not just a machine. Most people believe the body and mind isn't enough, so there's got to be something else, which is correct, namely an architectural theory of how all this works. But since they don't know any computer science, or for the most part any science at all, you always make a third box. And you can call it the spirit or the soul or the vital force. There's nothing in the box, but you feel much better. And it might be a healthy thing that if you discovered something new, you'd have a place to put it. So the feeling that you have that you can't be just a machine is sort of recognizing that just looking at the parts of something doesn't tell how it works. But there's nothing profound about it. I believe that if you say some mental states are emotional and some are intellectual, then you're back in Aristotle's time, and he was very good at this. I think the distinction is a way to avoid thinking about mental states rather than a helpful way. It's like people say emotions are different from thinking. It's like the difference between a black and white sketch and a colorful drawing. Well, I think that's nonsense. emotional states usually have less structure than other ways to think. A person who is in love has turned off critics. He sees the other person as not having any defects, being very valuable, very smart, very beautiful. The word beautiful to me means I'm in a state where I can't see all the flaws in it. And so to me, emotions are less than thinking, not more. And the distinction is really bad.
A few years ago, you said that if we had the right methods, we could create human-level AI with a Pentium chip. And there has been discussion about, is there some level of processing power that's a necessary but not sufficient condition to achieve AI? What's your view?
There was a study which suggested that a chess master can recognize about 20,000 patterns. That was de Groot's thesis. He was a student of Herbert Simon. And if we wrote a chess program that worked in terms of these strategies, then a very much smaller, the computer in here, in this camera, might be world chess champion. But what's happened is that people have worked on chess for 50 years without putting any strategic thinking into the programs. And so it's very low level. And
there has been some progress in that, actually. I mean, recently, chess programs running on PCs with 1% of the amount of computation of Deep Blue have actually performed better and now routinely defeat the world chess champion because of better pattern recognition.
But that's very interesting. Nobody really is in a position to guess how big a computer you need, or bigger, faster computer you need to do the highest levels of human thought. And I suspect it's rather small, and that each bit of what a computer does probably needs thousands of neurons. And so most of the brain is, because neurons are rather unreliable and noisy and flaky, we need a lot of them, but they're not computing very much.
Now, I have another angle on this, which may be not that useful in building a brain, but in terms of the complexity of the design of the brain, it's in the genome, including the epigenetic information. And the genome is replete with redundancies, and I've shown that a lossless compression applied to the genome would produce about 30 to 50 million bytes. So that's not simple, but that's a level of complexity we can manage.
Yes, that's probably less than the number of bits to make a 747.
Overall, how optimistic are you about the prospects for AI, particularly at the human level, as we go forward?
It's a very important question because I think we're going to need AIs before long. And the reason is one that you've considered, but most people haven't, which is that human longevity is going to grow very rapidly. In the past 60 years, in the developed countries, the lifespan has been increasing about 1 year every 4, so that people live 15 years longer now than they did in 1940. And I expect that this will keep going on or accelerate because nobody knows the causes for aging, but it's one reason to be optimistic is that we live twice as long as the chimpanzees. They live about 40 years, we live about 80 years, and it's been only 4 or 5 million years. Not many genes have changed. So it could be that you can double the lifespan by just changing a few genes or whatever, and I expect that we'll discover what those are pretty soon. And so we're going to face an interesting situation where people live for, say, 200 years, and of course they'll only have 1 child per person because the planet can't stand too many people. So there'll be a 160-year-old child for each 160-year-old semi-retiree, assuming people have to retire at all. Basically, there'll be no one to do the work. So we're going to need very smart machines to make the beds and nail the solar panels to the tops of the telephone poles and all the things that have to be done. So I hope we'll start working on trying to make resourceful, versatile machines much sooner, but once people start working on them, I can't imagine any particular obstacle for why they shouldn't get smarter and smarter. Of course, we have to worry that the first few hundred versions will be dangerous or treacherous or filled with mysterious bugs, and you have to be careful not to put them in charge of anything for a while, but that's true of any machine. And when cars came in, you had to teach people not to scare the horses with them. And
there's nothing to stop them from reaching human levels and surpassing human levels, is there?
I shouldn't think so. There was nothing to stop the chimpanzees from reaching human levels, and there'll be nothing to stop our machines from reaching human levels, and further, unless we stop them. And in fact, we better be very careful in the transitional stages, because it's not clear whose interest they have at heart.
What will the impact be of machines that are more capable than humans?
Well, when no one has to work, then they'll have to find something else to do. And I'm not too worried about that, because I understand that you can put 50,000 people in a football stadium for several hours watching people kick balls back and forth. And so I don't think people will have any trouble with the need to not do anything. But there will be a few uncomfortable people who actually want to accomplish something, and my heart goes out to them.
Well, my view is we're going to merge with the machines. We're going to put them in our bodies and brains. We're going to become part non-biological, and ultimately that non-biological part will dominate, and so we will become machines.
Yes, the transition may happen in various ways.
There's been discussion about the downsides: biotechnology gone awry, killer biological viruses, gray goo. With AI, the concern is unfriendly AI. If there's something more intelligent than you and has it out for you, that's not good news. How do we deal with that?
No one knows. How did the chimpanzees deal with it? Their population is down to the point where they're kept in museums and zoos, and there aren't enough wild ones. And there are various reasons why that's very bad.
So we are part chimpanzee, and these future machines, I think, will be part human because they'll have been derived from us.
They'll be derived, but they might recompile themselves and say, well, we have all these things we inherited from the humans, and they make us so slow that let's rewrite all the code and take out the old comments. I don't know whether one wants to have an attitude toward that. One of the problems that often come up is people say, scientists should be more responsible for what they do. Now, the fact is, a scientist is no better and possibly worse than the average person at deciding what's good and what's bad. And if you ask scientists to spend a lot of time deciding what to invent or not, all you can get from that is that they won't invent some things that might be wonderful. So someone has to decide, and I don't know what the best way is, but I certainly don't think that asking scientists to tell you their ethics will help. The question is the singularity near? And the answer is yes, depending on what you mean by near, but it may well be within our lifetimes.